So why is Alaska so big and why is it a U.S. state? In this video, I'll be exploring the history of Alaska and as well as its size. So Alaska is the biggest U.S. state at a whopping 665,400 miles squared, while Texas, being the second largest U.S. state, is only 268,597 miles squared, which means Alaska is almost 2.5 times bigger than Texas. The regular map of Alaska does not even show the true size because, as you can see, the Aleutian Islands down here extend for another 2,500 miles, or actually over 2,500 miles. If you take the Aleutian Islands into account, Alaska is actually almost as wide as the entire United States. Another interesting fact is Alaska is actually home to the westernmost point of the United States, which is the Amatignac Island, which is only 30 miles away from the eastern hemisphere, and also the easternmost point, which is only 8 miles into the eastern hemisphere. This means the eastern, western, and northernmost points of the United States are all in Alaska. Now moving on to the history of Alaska. These are the Aleut people, and they were the first group of people who were the first to come into contact with the Europeans from Alaska, and they're the ones who actually gave us the name Alaska. So the first time Europe came into contact with Alaska was in the 1700s when the Russian Empire discovered the Aleut people and Alaska, and they quickly realized there would be a lot of money to be made from the fur of seals, otters, and other Arctic creatures. However, the Russians could not catch any of the seals, otters, or other Arctic creatures, while the Aleut people could do it with ease as they'd been living in the region far longer than the Russians. So Alaska became a Russian colony, and the Aleut people were enslaved and forced to find the fur for the Russians. Originally, there were 300,000 otters in Alaska, but after 50 years of Russian colonization, this number had dropped to near extinction. And even today, there are only 50,000 otters left despite a century of conservation, showing the effects of Russian colonization. The Russians also introduced diseases to the Aleut people, which brought their population down by 80% by the 1800s, and today it's still less than what it was before the Russians arrived. Interestingly enough, despite being Russian for a century, no more than 1,000 Russians actually ever lived in Alaska itself. After disastrous defeat in the Crimean War of the 1850s, the Russians were in need of desperate money to pay their debts, and because Alaska was no longer profitable, the Russians decided to sell it. Even though Alaska, as you can see, borders British Canada, they didn't want to sell it to their arch enemies and instead decided to sell it to the recently unified United States for an equivalent of $140 million today, which is 25,000 times cheaper than buying Apple. Interestingly enough, in that same year of 1867, Russia had also offered to sell Alaska to Liechtenstein, but when Alexander II offered, Johann II, who was the Prince of Liechtenstein, declined, believing that the territory was useless. This would have been really funny because Alaska is almost 11,000 times bigger than Liechtenstein. The Russians had never explored the inland of Alaska and only ever settled in the Aleutian Islands and the Alaskan Panhandle, but when the Americans began to explore the interior, they found gold, and a lot of it. So much gold that they had to redefine the border of the Alaskan Panhandle with British Canada. This border wasn't agreed on until 1903 when the British accepted the American border, but the Canadians did not think these terms were rightful and refused to sign, but the British did on their behalf, which outraged the Canadians, and this was actually a large push for Canadian independence from Great Britain. And another interesting fact is actually that in the middle of the Bering Strait, which separates Russia and Alaska, lies two islands, Big Diomede and Little Diomede. Big Diomede belongs to Russia, while Little Diomede belongs to the US, and these islands are only 2.5 miles apart. As you can see in the winter, when the ice freezes, there's actually an ice bridge between the United States and Russia, which technically you could cross, but I don't see any reason why you'd want to do that. So this is how Alaska got passed on from Russia to almost Liechtenstein to the United States, and why it is actually the biggest state of the United States of America. If you want to see more, please like and subscribe.